Ready? All right, if you would turn to Genesis chapter 5. And we started a short study last week in Genesis, looking at things maybe we have not thought about before, or things that maybe we hurriedly read through some of these chapters that have genealogies and not really pay attention to what's there. I think we all do it from time to time. And it's always good to go back and look over these things and see what the Lord says about some of these people, because some of these people he does give us a little bit of information about. Some of them we don't. Some of them we never hear from again. Some we do. Last time we looked at the lineage of Cain, Adam and Eve's firstborn son. At the end of, back up to chapter 4, the end of chapter 4, the last two verses, we see for the first time Seth. And if you remember what we looked at last time, of course we started with Cain killing his brother Abel, and God basically throwing Cain out of the family, and not out of the Lord's family, but out of the Adam and Eve's family, run him off. He was chased off. He left, obviously left with one of his sisters, because he had a wife and had children by her. And then we saw where those in his line, what all they accomplished in those days. And if you remember, keep in mind, all of this happens before the flood. Everything we're looking at right now happens before the flood. And if we get time, maybe we'll see where the Lord leads with this. Maybe next week, maybe we'll look at some of Noah. I hadn't intended on going that far, but we might do that, because there are some things, even in the story of Noah, that we often either have forgotten or overlooked, and so we may carry it on with that. We saw where he had sons and grandsons and great grandsons, and everybody seemed to have lived somewhere between 700, 800, 900 years old, somewhere in that age range back then. Again, tonight we're going to look at Seth, and let's just go ahead and we'll start with verse 25 in chapter 4, and the rest of the time will be in chapter 5. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son, and called his name Seth, for God said, said she, this is Eve speaking, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. You notice, one thing I've noticed is, it seems like Eve talks more than Adam does, doesn't she? I'm not being derogatory towards women here, but I mean, here's the woman who ate of the fruit first. She talked to the serpent. We see the conversation between her and the serpent. Let's see. There was another time. In chapter 4, verse 1, Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain a tiller of the ground. Some say that Eve is the one that said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. Now, it might have been Adam that said that. We don't know, but some say Eve is the one who said that. And then here again, we see Eve is the one talking at the birth of Seth. So we don't hear much from Adam. I mean, we see him. He's there, obviously, because he's her husband, and we'll see more of him in the next chapter, in chapter 5, I just thought that was kind of interesting. Like I said, she seems to speak more than he does. And it's not anything profound usually, other than when she spoke with the serpent. But here, I mean, she just kind of speaks the obvious here. Again, Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son and called his name Seth. For God, said she, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. Now, there's a little bit of conversation out there on this. Hath appointed me another seed. Some say that Eve, and this goes all the way back to old Jewish writings, some say that Eve understood that Cain was not going to be in the line of, or the Messiah was not going to come in the line of Cain. It was going to have to be either Abel, or now that Abel was dead, it would have to be Seth. Did she understand that? Maybe. It's possible. Maybe the Lord told them. We don't know. Remember, they had conversations with the Lord. We don't know what they talked about, but that could have been one of the things. But it just seems kind of obvious here. She knew there was something about this seed was different. The seed of Seth. And to Seth, to him also there was born a son. So now we get into Seth's, the beginning of his lineage. And he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. And I've heard, I don't know how many sermons preached on just that part of the verse, that last part. It's interesting. It's an interesting phrase there. Then began man to call upon the name of the Lord. Again, you go back to some of the older Jewish writings, and they tell you that this is when men began to congregate to worship. Is that true? I don't know. Maybe. We know Cain and Abel, at least, had been taught by somebody to worship the Lord, didn't they? They brought sacrifices to him. Cain's was not the proper sacrifice, but he did know that he was supposed to bring something to the Lord. And Abel, bringing the proper sacrifice, did what was right. So we know that men, and remember Adam and Eve even, they called upon the name of the Lord, didn't they? At least while they were in the garden. After that, we don't know. It doesn't tell us. Eve, in verse 25 there, did. She said, for God. So she did. Cain and Abel had to have someone teach them. You would think it would be their father, right? Their earthly father. Then men, so by the time Seth comes along and Seth starts having children, men had already been calling upon the name of the Lord. They had already been speaking with God. But then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Notice this is Seth's line. You don't see this with Cain's line, do you? What was Cain's line doing? Well, other than what we read last time, they were building cities and making music and metallurgy and all that kind of stuff. They were raising cattle, lived in tents. They obviously were tent makers also. Other than that, we don't know their religious activities, do we? We did see the conversation between Cain and God when after Cain killed Abel. They had a pretty lengthy conversation there, and God told him what to expect. You're banished, and you're going to have a mark upon you, and everybody that sees you is going to know who you are. You're going to be famous, in other words, and not in a good way. Infamous. Is that what that's called? Anyway, so beginning with Seth's line, men began to call upon the name of the Lord. chapter 5. It says, this is the book of the generations of Adam. Now wait a minute. What about chapter 4? Was Cain not in the generations of Adam? He was. But, as we've seen when we studied Abraham, there came a point in time where Ishmael, Abraham's first son, with his handmaid, or his wife's handmaid, left the scene, and you didn't see him again. We're about to see the same thing happen to Cain. Cain's basically, to God, is a nobody now. God's not concerned with Cain's story. It comes up again, but for all intents and purposes, and purposes of God's word, the line of Seth is the one that God's going to work with and is going to love. And remember, we think about, well, what about the flood? Well, remember Noah and his sons? Whose line were they in? Well, they're in Seth's line, not Cain's. So this is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him, male and female. What does he say? Male and female. I don't care what anybody else says. There are only two, and that's it. If you claim to be a Christian and you think there's more than two, you need to check your salvation, because I don't believe you can't honestly believe that and be saved. That's just where I'm going to draw the line on, and that's my personal thought on it. Okay, can somebody be saved that believes that? Sure, certainly, but no true child of God is going to believe that garbage. They may tolerate it to a point, but even that, and I know that you see people who, either they have children that have gone that way, or their grandchildren, or friends, or other family, whatever, and they tolerate it. But if you're a child of God, you got to know that's not right. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam in the day when they were created. Now, what did he just say? And called their name Adam. They were created as one, remember? Remember, in the beginning, it was just the male part of the body. It wasn't until later that God performed surgery on Adam and created him a helpmeet, took a rib from his side. And even after that, when they were become husband and wife, what happened? They were to be one, weren't they? Do you remember who named the woman? It wasn't God, was it? It was Adam. He named his wife. He named her Eve. And let's let me see if I can find. I should have looked this up before, but I just thought of this. In verse 24 of chapter 2, therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. So yes, they were one from the beginning. In chapter 3, in verse 20, this is after the fall. And Adam called his wife's name Eve, because she was the mother of all living. Eve was not named by God. Now, did God have a hand in that? Maybe. It doesn't tell us. But Adam called his wife's name Eve. Remember, Adam got to name all the animals also. Well, it makes sense that he would get to name his wife, right? And So back in chapter 5, verse 2, and called their name Adam in the day when they were created. So in the very beginning of creation, when they were first created, when Adam was first created, they were one, still one. There was one person that God created. And then when Adam named all the animals and saw that there was no Mrs. Adam, like the animals had, he asked God for someone for him, and God put him to sleep and took a rib from his side and made Eve, made him a wife. And at what point were they married? We don't know. It doesn't tell us. Maybe it was immediately. She was his immediately. There was nobody else. So maybe they were, when he created Eve, that they were automatically married. I don't know. That's the only explanation I know. And so they were always one flesh. They came from the same flesh, right? She came from him. So, verse 3, and Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness after his image, and called his name Seth. Remember, it doesn't say that about Cain, does it? He begat a son in his own likeness after his image. In other words, he was just like his daddy. He was just like Adam in all ways. And we think about that and we think, well, we don't hear much about Adam, but he being the first man, you would think he was a pretty good guy. I kind of doubt that he was an alcoholic. They probably didn't have any alcohol at that point. Or maybe they did. They could have grown grapes, I guess, and had wine. But you don't see. We know they sinned. We know they fell against God. Does that mean his son was the same way? Sure it does. But he's more like his dad than Cain, because he doesn't say that about Cain. You notice he lived 130 years before he begat Seth. It doesn't tell us how old he was when Cain and Abel were born, does it? We don't know. They were grown, obviously, before, and it appears, one of the writers I was looking at mentioned that Seth, the way this is worded, Seth probably was born not too long after Cain killed Abel, because they wanted another son. And remember, this is only 130 years since creation. That's something else to think about. We don't really think. We think they lived to be 900 years old. That's a long time, and 130 years seems like a long time, but back then it really wasn't, was it? 130 years from the day of creation? That's not, not since the day of creation. It would be the sixth day of creation when Adam was created. So everything's still new on the earth. And the days of Adam after he had beget Seth were 800 years, and he beget sons and daughters. So Adam had more sons and daughters. Were they all with Eve? Don't have a clue. Doesn't tell us, does it? Eve's, in this story anyway, Eve's not mentioned again. So we have no clue. We do know that Cain's, one of his was sons or grandsons or great-grandsons, I forget which one, was the first man to have two wives, wasn't he? He tells us that. All the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. And you guys think y'all are old. Can you imagine being 930 years old? I can remember growing up. I remember my granddad's younger brother. I worked with him some. He was born in 1920, and he was 70 or 72 at the time. He was telling me this. He said, all the things that have taken place in my life up until now, he said, I can't imagine that much stuff happening or that much advancement taking place in the next 70 years, is what he told me. And I think back on that, and that was the late 80s, early 90s maybe when he told me that. Well, it had to be, he was born 1920, so it had to be 1990, 91, somewhere in there. And I'm like, all the advances that we've seen since 1990 to now, we've seen a lot. But, you know, he was raised in the day and time when not everybody had a car. Most people, he lived out in the country. Most people still had horse and buggies and horse and wagons, and they walked a lot of places. And they didn't have televisions and probably didn't have a radio and that kind of stuff. Didn't have indoor plumbing. You know, they relied on a well. So you think about 930 years, what all happened in that time that Adam would have seen. All his, who knows, I wouldn't even know how to begin to count the generations. I'm sure somebody has done that. But all the generations of his that he would have saw. And if I remember right, I did go through one time, it's been years ago, Adam almost lived long enough to see Noah. Not quite, but almost. He almost lived long enough to see the flood. And we'll get to that part at another time. But and Seth lived 105 years and begat Enos. Now, I want us to remember, the Lord is recording here the lineage of Jesus Christ. Remember, Jesus is the whole topic of the Bible, if you want to put it that way. Enos, Seth was 105 years and begat Enos. We don't know that Enos was his first child. 108 years, he probably had children before that. Adam had children before Seth. We know that, at least 2. Well, more than that, because remember, Cain married somebody, you know, and it had to be a daughter of Adam. So Enos wasn't necessarily the firstborn. Remember, the Lord, it's kind of odd because the way the Lord taught in the law for Israel was that the oldest son was to get the inheritance. But that's not the way it always works out in the Bible, is it? We look at Abraham. It was his second son that was the true seed, the true promise. Esau and Jacob. You know, Joseph, you know, when he was in Israel, he wound up being much greater than his older brothers. And you just keep on going. David was the youngest, wasn't he? It keeps on going. So it's very possible that Enos was not the oldest son, even though he's the promised seed. He may not have been the oldest son. Or it could be that maybe he was the first son and all the ones before him were girls. You know, that's possible too. And Seth lived, after he begat Enos, 807 years and begat sons and daughters. Again, we don't see any names. We don't see any we don't see a number. How many sons and daughters he had, we have no clue. Why? I believe it's because he wants us to concentrate on the lineage of Christ, not anybody else. Remember back in chapter 4 with Cain? We saw more. No, not a whole lot more detail, but we saw some more detail. It did name some more of brothers and even one sister there that was born. You don't see this in Seth's line. All the days of Seth were 912 years. So he lived a few years less than his father did, his father Adam. And he died. And Enos lived 90 years and begat Canaan. And Enos lived, after he begat Canaan, 815 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enos were 905 years, and he died. And Canaan lived 70 years and begat Mahalalel. Now notice, Enos and Canaan were having children at 90 years and at 70 years. That's why I say when you go back to the others, them having a son at 130 years or whatever it was, 130 years was when Seth was born. There's a very great possibility they had more children before him. You know, so it's just that he is the one the Lord has chosen for the lineage. And all the days of Enos, Canaan lived 70 years and begat Mahalalel, and Canaan lived after he begat Mahalalel 840 years and begat sons and daughters, and all the days of Canaan were 910 years, and he died. So far, everybody has lived over 900 years. Mahalalel lived 65 years and begat Jared. And Mahalalel lived after he begat Jared 830 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. So here's the first one that lived less than 900 years old. And Jared lived 162 years, and he begat Enoch. And Jared lived after he begat Enoch 800 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. He lived pretty old, didn't he? But not the oldest. We'll get to the oldest one here pretty soon. And Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. We've heard that name before, haven't we? And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years and begat sons and daughters. Notice Enoch is the first one that it mentions that walked with God. What about before him? Well, the last verse of chapter 4 told us that that's when the men began to call upon the name of the Lord, was with Seth's lineage. So you would think that these others were faithful to the Lord, but there's something special about Enoch. He's more faithful than the others, it appears. And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Notice it doesn't say, and he died, because he didn't. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not. What does that mean? Well, I didn't know. I had never heard anybody dispute that. I did find in some of the study I did that there have been, throughout history, there have been those who say that that just means that he died an earthly death. Well, no, that's not what the original text says. It is not the meaning here. He was not. It means that God took him. It says that in the very next part of the verse. For God took him. And Methuselah lived 187 years and begat Lamech. And Methuselah lived after he begat Lamech 782 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. You know, again, he died. You don't see that with Enoch. Methuselah being the oldest recorded person in the world. And people say, you know, if you look at other writings and other civilizations even, no one ever lived that long that they've ever found recorded. 969 years. Um, I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us what they're in those 900 years, 900 something years, how, at what age they became mature, sexually mature, and could start having children. And it doesn't tell us when that stopped, when they were no longer able to. But if it's only just a few hundred years, they could have had a lot of children. And some say that the population of the earth before Noah or in Noah's day, before the flood, very possibly could have been several million people, maybe in the billions, depending on how many children they had. Those are things that we don't commonly think about. That before the flood, they weren't a bunch of cave dwellers. Some of them may have lived in caves for shelter, but we've already seen where Cain built a city. He had sons and grandsons that were good with their hands, metallurgy and music, and raised cattle. These weren't a bunch of Neanderthals. They were cavemen. These were intelligent people. And you can imagine if you lived to be almost 100 years old, or almost 900 years old, or almost 900 years old. Just like with us today, your knowledge continues to grow. And we also realize too that the Lord has a hand in everything that goes on in this world. We look back through history, and the history that we know of that's recorded, and we wonder, how did that guy think about that? Where did they get the idea to make the internal combustion engine? I don't know anybody smart enough to come up with that, to be honest. I don't know if I ever have known anybody that intelligent. Maybe there was somebody out there, but that just shows me that the Lord had a hand in everything that has happened. And he has had man create things or invent things that sometimes they give God credit for it, sometimes they don't. But I believe not all, but most things that man has invented has been something that could further the gospel, isn't it? We look at, you go back to the wheel. What happened? When man invented the wheel. Well, it made it possible to get the gospel around further than it was for somebody to walk. Same way with cars today. We can jump in the car and we can go wherever we want till you get to the ocean and talk to people about the Lord, can't we? Same way with the internet. We have access to the whole world. Anybody anywhere in the world that has access to the internet can watch our sermons. We can carry on a conversation with them. You can, if they got a good enough signal and you got a good enough signal, you can video chat with them if you can understand their language. And there's even things now to fix that. You can have a translator, an AI translator, to translate what they're saying. So the vast majority of what man has invented, God had a hand in. Now, you say, well, why wouldn't he have a hand in everything? Well, remember, there are some wicked things that I believe Satan helped man with. You look at the occult and things that have come out of that, and so you have to be careful there. Lamech lived 182 years and begat a son, and he called his name Noah. So now we see Noah. The same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord hath cursed. So Lamech is the one who says this about his son Noah. This is a prophecy. This Noah shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands because of the ground which the Lord hath cursed. What happened with the flood? Everything was pretty well wiped out, wasn't it? Everything living that wasn't on the earth wound up dead. Humans, animals, whatever, except for the sea life. And Lamech lived, after he begat Noah, 595 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. So Lamech didn't live very long, did he? Only 777 years. I mean, compared to the rest of them, he died 200 years too early, huh? But remember the flood. And I'm a firm believer that I think Noah and his family were the only ones on the earth who were saved at the time of the flood. Or at least by the time God sealed up the ark. I don't believe any of God's people died in the flood. That was God's wrath on unsaved people. It was not wrath on his own people. And then it says, and Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now that doesn't mean that they were triplets. Some try to say that. It doesn't mean that he was 500 years old before these guys were born, but he was 500 years old when this part of the story comes about, when we start this part of the story. We're going to stop there for tonight. We'll get into chapter 6. I think we're going to go ahead and go into chapter 6, and we'll look at chapter 6 next time. There's some things there that I think are interesting, certainly. Things that are controversial. And some things that are misunderstood that we'll look at next time. So come back and be with us next time for chapter